Thanks. I'd like to thank all the sponsors. My name's Bryan, and let me get these back in order. Okay, I'm here today to give this talk about the relationship and kind of analyze the relationship between cyber liability insurance and information security. And is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick show of hands, how many people here have dealt with either any legal people or any cyber liability people in your day-to-day work? Okay, that's actually more than I kind of expected. I saw a guy do that earlier, and no one raised their hands, and he was also doing it for legal. And I was like, okay, I'll do that too. But okay, cool. So a little bit about me. I currently am a policy analyst at a company called Risk Genius, and we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to break down insurance policies and review them quantitatively to determine where gaps are and where industry standards are. And then we also help companies kind of harmonize their workflows internally with regard to that. I also manage Kansas City's Legal Hackers chapter, and Legal Hackers is basically a nonprofit, or it's just a community meetup where we try and figure out how to better marry law and technology together. We actually got to help the city. We helped figure out how to come up with a better legal framework with Airbnb, but we also applied to the IEEE Smart Cities Conference, or Smart Cities, what was it? Their, to get that credential of being an IEEE Smart City. And then I'm also doing a couple other side projects as well with Codex and with the Legal Technology Lab. I am a licensed attorney, and a lot of my work there focuses on information privacy and how to protect it, how to help clients in figuring out how to manage best their technological assets. And that's kind of what has gotten me into this field of cyber liability insurance. So here's a quick overview of the talk. I'm going to focus on the concept of risk management generally, figure out how both law and information security kind of exist on this spectrum for risk management. They're very clear impacts in the cyber liability insurance world, and it was great that the guy in front of me was talking about using open source information and social engineering to hack into people and hack into people's data, figure out how to do identity theft. I was searching for identity theft, and I just found it. But one of the things that each industry has that's very interesting to me is each has their own strengths and weaknesses. And the fun part about the work that I do is I get to figure out how to leverage the strengths of each and turn them into kind of this holistic, redesigned way of thinking about risk management. And I get to work with people who use advanced computer science techniques to do that. And it's anything from AI to machine learning to neural network creation to there's another one, I forgot it. But okay, so yeah, as I was saying, both of these are risk management. There are really a lot of types of risk management. There's financial risk management, there's operational risk management, there's legal, there's technical risk management. And in each of these areas, to really have a comprehensive strategy, you need to communicate very well with each other. So figuring out how to develop a language or some sort of ontology that gets people speaking with one another in terms that they understand, and doing that in a productive and constructive way, so that maybe if you're on the information security side, you're using language that the legal side doesn't get, or vice versa. I know with a lot of people bash on lawyers for using legalese and kind of unnecessarily, and I've noticed a big push away from that, but if we can talk in the same way, we'll be able to develop more comprehensive strategies, we'll be able to operate more efficiently, and we'll be able to prevent data from unnecessarily being turned over, or if data is turned over, we'll be able to ensure that there is some sort of remedy for that. And so that's a very exciting prospect. Some of the characteristics I want to talk about for each of these sub-industries of risk management. With insurance, there's a really slow implementation of policies. I mean, there's been cyber liability policies around for probably 15 or 20 years. There are, compared to other lines of business in the insurance world, there are relatively few policies, probably fewer than 100 across all industries. But insurance is kind of necessarily reactive. You have to have an event take place that screws everything up, and then you're able to recover. Whereas on the other side, with information security, you kind of look at these things proactively. You figure out, hey, how do we make sure this doesn't get touched? And so what I want to focus on with this talk is, like, how do we kind of marry these two together so that there's as small of a gap as possible between the proactive and the reactive, between what happens faster, and that is information security, what happens faster and what happens slower with insurance. Because if that can happen, you can provide a lot of value to the places that you work, or the people who depend on you. And this means the question that we have to answer in order to figure out how to achieve all of these things is, how do we reduce these gaps between information security and legal departments, and in order to maximize coverage and limit exposure. And the solution that I kind of came up with was that you can do this by leveraging some of the advances in computing technology to improve the way that all of these professionals interact with one another. You can make everything more interoperable, and you can start to develop comprehensive frameworks that use the same language across the board, and that would, in my mind, be a language that everybody can readily understand. And you take it from this kind of workflow where everything's kind of siloed off in a bunch of different locations across a bunch of different departments, or across a bunch of different people, and you turn it into something where you can have a lot more collaboration, you can have a lot more people who understand on a broader scale, like what the goal is that you're trying to achieve. And so one of the things that I wanted to start thinking about was, like, what should risk management look like? What would a futurist risk management strategy look like? How could we test and prove some of these strategies? What would it look like in practice? And how would you be able to develop these kind of ontologies, or these sets of new words that derive some meaning from that is common to each industry, or each sub-industry of the risk management practice? And so I think that starts looking like natural language processing and the quantification of text. And what I mean by that is, when you can start breaking down insurance policies into bits of data that are actually able to be tagged with information and metadata, you can start showing how these pieces of information affect each other. And you can start using machine learning to map some of these things out, map these relationships out, and you can start to see quantitatively where the gaps exist, where the coverage is weaker, where the coverage is stronger, and you can start protecting your assets in not just based on, like, some lawyer vouching for his work. You can empirically look at this and say, hey, we have a good policy. It's got like a 95% match for whatever else it is we're trying to protect. Like, that's the best match we can find out of anywhere in the insurance world. Like, let's use it. And so when you start kind of breaking all of these things down and you start thinking about them as abstractions, you can begin to redesign the workflow from something that has traditionally been very static into something that's a lot more dynamic. You can actually start beginning to increase that interoperability, and this is where I think the symbiotic relationship starts to reveal itself. With insurance, you have, if you have all of this text broken down into data, you have increased reporting, you can do that in real time, you have greater transparency, and this is something that obviously can be used to reduce gaps. On the information security side, I think it's a lot more exciting, and I'm not an information security guru by any means. I tweeted earlier that in the legal community, I'm the tech guy, but here at BSides, I'm definitely not the tech guy. So I will leave that to more of the tech people. But one of the things that I see as a huge value add to information security professionals is that if you start thinking about risk management in this symbiotic way where each side gets something out of it, you can start to leverage connections with larger groups to help scale your operations. You can start developing a better continuity with your risk management practices from an information security side that's backed up by this cyber liability data, these cyber liability insurance policies. And this will give you kind of an increased ability to legally recover as well. So if something does, like if it all hits the fan, you'll be able to recover if you start making these types of partnerships. And that's like when a whole community of an industry can benefit. I think that's a really positive thing, and that's something that a lot of people should pine for and pay attention to. And so now I'm going to kind of get into some of what I do on a day-to-day basis in my work, and that is like quantifying cyber liability risk into actual pieces of information and using that information to make informed decisions and reports about where a specific policy is with regard to other policies, where a specific policy would be in regard to an industry-wide standard, and figuring out what the gaps are for different companies or different brokerages, and using that information to improve insurance outputs. And so this is one of the first things that I do is I'll pick in a policy, gets broken down using machine learning into all of these clauses. I tag the clauses for a bunch of pieces of information, and we start kind of breaking them down into different chunks that can operate with one another. And so this is some old data, and I don't mean for this to be a demo, but this is kind of where a lot of this information has come to me from, and this is kind of the backbone of how I got into this mindset of thinking about things this way. And so we've actually processed more policies than this in total. I think in total we've processed around 3,000 policies, around probably 100, which would be almost all the cyber liability policies that are out there. And this is, to me, the most interesting part is there are 136 that have definitions for what malicious code means. And for cyber liability insurance policies, you would think that malicious code or computer virus, that's a pretty important definition to have. And one of the sample definitions that we have, and I don't know if you can read this, but it goes over what malicious code means, and it's got this really long, it's a pretty good explanation of what it should be. But when you start comparing that with other pieces of information, you really see like, hey, like there's a crazy disparity among all of these different carriers who are some of the biggest carriers in the world, and they've all got hugely different definitions of what it means. And I've isolated here just a few examples where it talks about any malicious software file or virus, and that's like, it seems like it would be a catch-all, but in the insurance world, when you actually have litigation, you have the strongest likelihood of recovering if you specifically identify something. So it's in your interest to, as specifically as possible, go in, account for everything that you need to account for. And when you have really like vague language, that decreases your likelihood of recovering. So if you're a company that has a lot of data assets and you want to be sure that they're protected from new threats that are emerging, so maybe new types of ransomware or whatever it is that, like the WannaCryptor or WannaCry. Like if you know that that's something that's out there, like you should want to specifically have that in your policy. You should want to go in and account for all of the known threats that you can think of, because then you'll be able to recover from those in the event of a breach. And kind of conversely, if you're already in a cyber liability insurance contract and you know you're locked into it for a while and you know it doesn't cover a lot of things, you should like actively seek out an information security professional who can help you find a solution that accounts for that vulnerability that you have, that you've identified from your insurance policy. And so this is an entire policy that's been broken down clause by clause and compared with every other available clause in our cyber liability index that we use. And you can see here the top, that's usually the what we call the control clause, or the clause that's used to as the main comparator, like as the clause that everything else gets compared against. And so you can see here that for something as basic as event management, which would control what your obligations are in the event that something did go wrong, you can see here that there's a crazy disparity between your policy and everybody else's policy. You can say, hey, like, we have to do something that nobody else really has to do. Like, the closest match is maybe 60%, but everybody else is way down there. Like, we're doing something either wrong or right, but that's something, that's a red flag that should be raised. That's something you should, like, you can quantitatively go in there and say, hey, this needs to be reviewed. We need to set up some controls and protocols that show when we need to review these clauses to make sure that our cyber assets are going to be covered. Okay. And where I think this, I spent a lot of the last few days trying to think of specific examples of information security practices that could be applied using these insights in more of an insurance setting. And the ones that I came up with kind of readily were, you can do data monitoring of insurance. You can look at the industry standards that are scored geometrically against each other. You can say, hey, this is where there's a large disparity between what people are doing. Hey, this is where everything's kind of unified. Hey, this is where we need to work harder on all of these things. But you can also do audits where you figure out, hey, how do I, where are we most vulnerable? What should we, how can we start patching some of these things that we have and ensuring that we're compliant with all of the regulations that we need to be compliant with? How can we start doing insurance pen testing is basically what I want everybody to focus on. And I think this is one of the ways that you start to get there, is you start putting everything in the same framework that you would have as a pen tester, and that's having data, having it mapped out, and then telling people to go through it and search for it and try and figure out, like, do we have the best thing that we could have? Does it cover what we need it to cover? Are we going to be protected in the event that something happens? Are we going to be protected in the event that something else happens? And that's why I think it's important to start thinking about this as not all of these things, not as like isolated things, but they're all really spokes on the same wheel. And you want to, the more that information security professionals professionals know about cyber liability insurance, the better the risk management strategy would be. The more legal professionals know about information security, the more comprehensive that coverage could be. And some of the specific insurance and information security use cases that I would like to explore a lot more and would be interested to talk with you all about would be like, how could you match information security vendors with known gaps in various cyber liability policies? How could you use an API to harmonize risk management strategies between insurance and InfoSec groups to improve the efficiencies and mitigate the vulnerabilities, sort of by that insurance pen testing idea that I was kicking around? How could you quantitatively analyze the insurance market to determine what your best policy would be, or where the coverage is the most coverage across the board is the most lacking? And then this could even also be used as a marketing tool for different value-added resellers to attract new clients. If they can go in and say, hey, we know based on your cyber liability policy that you're vulnerable to this, this, and this. Here are some people you should look at partnering with. We can help you partner with those people. And so that's kind of where I think all of this is headed. And that's something I'm definitely interested in learning more about. But that's actually all I've got. So I'd love to take some questions and comments out there.
So do you anticipate the insurance providers stipulating the policies that the organizations they insure must adhere to certain guidelines, like say the SAM Top 20 or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or even be required to comply with, or not comply with, but to adhere to industry best practices that might be more specific to those guidelines?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've seen, I think, with some of the largest insurance carriers in the world that when they're insuring large companies, they'll throw in language like that as either an endorsement or an exclusion, where they require you to have it or they exclude it if you're operating outside of that. And so I think that's definitely where it is going, and it's already started to go that way a little bit. But I think I would be really interested to see it, as you were kind of talking about, more broken down, like into the very specific niches of each industry and sub-industry and sub-industry. And yeah, I think that that's definitely where I see it is going. Yeah.
Do you see or feel any pressure in the insurance industry that is leading to businesses and corporations defining their IT security programs based around ways to lower their premiums or be in compliance with insurance policies, or some other sort of guideline that's essentially established and pushed by the insurance side of things just because it's listened to by the people underwriting insurance in the company, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so and I think this is the question you were asking. Is there any pressure from within the insurance companies to harmonize everything within either their company that they like in issuing policies, or to other companies and figuring out how to make everything kind of synergized in a way? Is that right?
Maybe a little, more like, has there been a trend of companies saying suddenly we are aware that we can buy insurance, they look into insurance and realize it's very expensive, for example, and then they start looking into things that they can do to reduce the expense or bring themselves into the scope of the insurance policy, not necessarily the particular security policy, which will still lead to a more secure infrastructure should the pressures coming from the insurances. Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, so I think one of the areas where I've seen that most clearly is there's international brokerage that has started. They have a legal innovation team that works to figure out ways to make their policies more flexible and allows them to account for different changes, so that it's not necessarily they're trying to fit like some specific mold, but they're trying to figure out what a spectrum would look like, instead of trying to say, hey, do you meet these 5 checkpoints on our list, or like how can we work with you to ensure that what we're giving you fits exactly what you're looking for. And I think that's a direction where and I think it's more so coming from the largest insurance, like it's not the middle guys, because the large companies are throwing a lot of money at it to make it to bring in professionals who are usually startup people, legal people, and innovators to kind of figure out how to do that internally. But you also have some of the smaller insurance brokerages out there who work on a kind of like a more artisan, bespoke model to develop policies specifically for clients.
A couple of questions. Earlier on one of your slides, you said, okay, proactive, they're using initiatives framework on the infosec side, and on the insurance side, you mentioned ISO. Are they trying to push the ISO framework, or is it just meaning something else?
So there, I was just trying to point to some of the standards making groups within the insurance industries, or insurance industry. ISO actually doesn't have a cybersecurity framework that they've been developing.
They've got a 27,001 standard.
Oh, okay. And then AAIS is, I think, the American Association of Insurance. I forget what that stands for, but they're also another group. They're kind of more of a nonprofit than ISO is, but they're also working to see, like, hey, what is the standard for all of these things, and how do we make it so that some coverages aren't grossly inadequate and ensure that people across the board are protected.
Do you think the insurance company is trying to get more responsible?
I think so. I think cyber liability insurance is like having to figure that out is something that's opened their eyes to, like, hey, we have to be more adaptive in this world where we're trying to protect people against things that we don't even know about yet. Like, it's always going to be, like, you're always going to be trying to catch up, and you're always going to be trying to figure out how to stay one step ahead. And with something that could change with one line of code, you know, you've got to really know how to do that well. And so I think they're all trying to move that direction.
Well, I think there's going to be new standards coming out that help care the law.
Yeah.
So that's part of it.
Okay. And then we have time for one more? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so do insurance companies currently require access to any IT review reports from third parties for those insurers?
Some of them do. I couldn't name them off the top of my head because we kind of deal with them in the aggregate. But yeah, some of them do, which is exciting because I think more should. But yeah. Thank you guys all for your time, and I actually get to throw out some t-shirts. So.
Thank you, Bryan. Bryan Wilson.